Okay,
This
you're
link
live.
is fine. Okay, now take this link.
Where's the share button?
Oh, wow.
Oh, here. Yeah, that link. And then go put that in the other one.
You want to forward that to your email?
No, I'm not. That's a. All right, that's good. You can leave that. Just turn this.
Yeah.
It's gonna work. All right, it's working.
What is this thing? What's it watching?
So, do you want it in the first row?
No, just took a second. No. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you use this camera instead?
No, it's saying you can't do. Or dude,
Use it
hold on. Huh?
Can you watch? Can you do this camera and just stream it there? Yeah.
No, see, look, look.
Oh.
Waste.
Waste of shit.
All right.
Just put it in the first one. If you put something underneath it, you could. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, go on that.
No, this is good. This is good.
You can use it next. It's free.
Yeah.
This is not doing anything, but just to make
Whatever.
yourself feel better.
Yeah. Actually, we can do this. Unless we can record during the session.
You could just
Yeah,
I could. It's done. Yeah.
I don't think anyone's gonna figure it out. The new link. Or are you recording on now? Don't do 4K. It's gonna kill everything.
Oh, please don't run. Your battery's gonna run out.
No, do 30 FPS. It's like 50. I'm not moving.
Trust me, he doesn't want.
I'm not gonna move things.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So the order is that. So after like when I see. Session could be anyone. Just depends on the. My guess is they're not. Yeah, you guys get. So much. I mean, I obviously. It's on there. Yeah, you can go right now. It's open. She's gonna be coming. Right now it's open. Apparently YouTube wouldn't let me broadcast on my phone. Never used it before, so we have to do it. Not sure I'm using it. It's a view, it's 191 view. Well, I'm gonna go in and refresh the stuff. You want to watch it? I won't have it.
You don't have to look at it.
I'll put. Karen, how are you?
You feel like it's high.
Yeah, thank you.
It's
This is a good spot.
yeah, it's perfect. Yeah, it's a very sharp.
Yeah, I'm going to speak louder.
That's good.
Well, I'm gonna turn it, it's off right now.
So, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh no, he's staying. He's staying. He's staying. So I guess you did a bunch of job search. Why so long?
Good.
We'll text him here.
Okay.
Is it just like friends of yours?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you would just like
Yeah. Hey Vincent, can you hear me? Yeah.
So I think it's less of a yeah.
Just walk.
Right, right. So it's very much more expensive.
Yeah. It's too hard to get.
Like that, should we do one down? Just take the So I have to give
Sure, typo.
Okay, so Hi everyone, welcome. Today we're going to have a piece of defense of Arnav. He joined the lab N years ago from UT Austin, and we were really lucky and thrilled to recruit him to our liver group. He's since gone on to do the body of work you'll see today, which is really incredibly interdisciplinary and pulls from a lot of different fields. He's gotten a lot of awards. He's a Soros Fellow, an NSF Fellow. He's a Forbes 30 under 30. He's a Harry Potter fan, amongst other things. And actually, he's brought his brother to our lab this summer, so it's a family affair. And I'm very happy to introduce him now to share his work. So welcome.
So thank you for joining me today. For those who don't know me, my name is Arnav, and I'm really excited to share with you the culmination of my thesis work. And I hope by the end of this talk, you guys are as excited by cell-based therapies as I am. So when I first got started as a grad student, I was really interested in epidemiological trends. We kept hearing that we're in the golden age of medicine and that disease mortality was on the decline. But what I was curious about was how that mortality looked across different diseases. So I dug into the data, and what I'm showing up here is a geographical heat map of disease mortality across the United States. And once I start the video, what you'll see is that each frame represents a snapshot of a different year. And as you can see, the deaths per 100,000 from cardiovascular disease has been consistently going down over the last 35 years. But if you look at the same data, but for chronic liver disease, the trend is the complete opposite. More people are dying from chronic liver disease every year over the last 35 years. One of the reasons why this is happening is because for the sickest patients, the patients who are in end-stage liver failure, there's not enough donor organs to go around. So for these people, the only cure is what we call an orthotopic liver transplant. And if you look at the data, for the number of transplants that are available and the number of people who need a transplant, there's always a gap of about 4,000 people every year. So there's about 4,000 people every year who need a transplant but cannot get one. And another one of the reasons why the liver is so hard to target therapeutically is because of its complexity. So at the core of the liver is this parenchymal cell, the cell that we call the hepatocyte, and the hepatocyte performs the lion's share of its functions. So just to contrast, for example, when we think about diabetes, we're often talking about the pancreatic beta cells, and we're often talking about recapitulating the insulin-producing capabilities of these cells. However, when it comes to the hepatocyte, it has over 500 different functions. It has endocrine functions, it has exocrine functions, it has detoxification functions, storage functions, and it can also regenerate. So because of this panoply of functions it can perform, it's been really hard to target therapeutically using conventional therapies. Conventional therapies like small molecules, antibodies, proteins, and gene-based delivery mechanisms typically target one or two pathways at most. And as I showed before, in chronic liver disease, a lot of these different pathways are controlled. And because of that, there have been exactly 0 FDA-approved therapies in chronic liver disease. And let me actually emphasize that again. At a time when biotech investment is at its peak, there's precisely 0 FDA-approved therapies for the entire spectrum of chronic liver disease. So what a lot of people have suggested is that forget about conventional therapies, why don't we just take the cell itself and utilize that as a therapeutic agent? So what that looks like in practice is you can take hepatocytes from somebody, from a donor who's passed away, and then inject them directly into various sites in the body. And that's what we call hepatocyte transplantation. Or you can take the hepatocytes, put them in a graft, and then implant that entire graft into the body. While the concept is very promising, there's been a few shortcomings in its application. So one of the problems that ends up happening is that when you put these hepatocytes either in a graft or inject them directly, only a small percentage of them actually end up going to where you need them to go. And that's what we call roll and wrap. The second problem is that, as I mentioned before, one of the functions of the hepatocyte is its regeneration capabilities. When you take the hepatocytes out of the native microenvironment and put them in another person's body, they lose this expansion potential. So they're not able to expand in a proper way. The last problem is that cell-based therapies tend to be very immunogenic. Cells are antigen-producing factories, and over time, these cells get recognized by the immune system, and because of that, these cell-based therapies often do not persist for long periods. So the way our lab has thought about it is that the way these cells exist inside of the body is that they live in these well-constructed homes. They don't live as single cells. So why don't we just try to construct these homes for them outside of the body? And to do that, we've leveraged tools from the microelectronics industry. We've taken sort of micro technology tools and nanotechnology tools, and we've tried to construct these microenvironments for them. So we've shown that when you add in multicellular interactions, so interactions between the hepatocytes and other cell types such as the endothelial cells, or you add in architecture, if you, as you might recall, the beautiful image of the liver that I showed you had this beautiful sensory architecture. Or you can also add in vascularization, and we've shown that as these grafts are expanding, you need more and more blood vessels to support them. Once you integrate all three of them and put them inside of a graft and implant that graft, we've shown that you get improved engraftment just based on these three improvements. However, there's still two other things that are left, which are poor expansion and poor persistence. And that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll be talking about how we can utilize the microenvironment and leverage it in order to improve the expansion capabilities of primary human hepatocytes, and also make them less immunogenic so they don't get recognized by the immune system. So to do this, I'll split my talk into three different sections. The first section is going to be an engineering focus section, where we've developed an integrated vascularized liver model that we can then take and perturb in many different ways. In the second section, which I called expand, we're going to turn these knobs in many different ways and add in a lot of these stimuli that the liver sees when it's inside the body. And we'll see whether we can get hepatocytes to enter cell cycle. And lastly, we'll take these hepatic constructs, these microlivers that we make, and try to create a shield around them so that they can be hypoimmune and not get recognized by the immune system in vivo. So we'll get started with the develop section first. So before we created our own model, we dug through the literature to see what other models existed out there. So typically the way people study liver regeneration right now is they take the liver, they damage it in some way, shape, or form. So you can either do it using surgical techniques, you can use a toxin, or you can use genetic manipulation. And then they observe as the liver grows back. And during the observation period, you can use several readouts. You can look at the size of the liver itself. You can see what's present in the blood, these soluble factors. Or you can see whether the hepatocytes are entering cell cycle or not. And for one of these models, which is called the partial hepatectomy model, you take the liver, you surgically resect about 2/3 of it, as shown down here, and then you observe its growth. So in about 4 weeks in rodents, it comes back to its full size. And during that period, you can see what changes are happening, because that will tell us what are the important parameters for creating a model. And the first parameter that's really important is hemodynamics. And I think this video actually shows it really well. So when you resect, again, 2/3 of the liver, the same amount of blood flow now has to go through a smaller vasculature volume. And because of that, you get two things. One is you get increased blood flow, which leads to more shear stress on the cells. And it also leads to what we call circumferential stretch of the endothelial cells. And these things end up causing a lot of the character instructions downstream. The second parameter that happens is you have increased presence of these blood-borne stimuli. So there were these beautiful experiments in 1951 where scientists by the name of Nancy Bucher showed that if you take two rats, you connect their vasculature in what we now call parabiosis, and injure the liver in one of the rats, the hepatocytes in the other rat will actually enter cell cycle. Which is kind of an incredible finding, right? Because that essentially proves to us that there's something in the blood of the first rat just after a simple injury that is actually getting the hepatocytes to enter cell cycle. So we know that blood-borne stimuli are important. The last factor that's important has been shown by Shaheen Rafi and many others, which we call multicellular signal. So hepatocytes, when they grow back after an injury, they don't grow back by themselves. They grow back in concert with other cell types, such as endothelial cells. So for example, what I'm showing is the endothelial cells produce factors like HGF, which is hepatocyte growth factor. And then the hepatocytes in turn produce factors like VEGF, which is vascular endothelial growth factor. There's this symbiotic relationship that helps the graft expand and also helps it vascularize as it grows. So our goal was we want to take all three of these parameters and integrate into a model system. And to do that, we utilize soft microfluidics. Chris Chen, who's also on the committee, has shown that his lab can create these beautiful biofabricated blood vessels. And they've shown that when you include these in soft microfluidic platforms, you get emergent vascular biology. You get perfusible structures, you can have flow through these vessels, and you can test permeability by looking at the barrier function. And on the other side, our lab has shown that we can take micro nanotechnology tools and create what we call 3D microlivers. And to create these 3D microlivers, we take human hepatocytes, co-aggregate them with these stromal cells called fibroblasts, and at the end of about 1 or 2 days, you get these nice 3D microlivers. And we've also shown that hepatocytes by themselves don't do all that well, so they do actually need these supporting cell types. So once we integrate both of these two different systems into one platform, and that's how we get this device called Shear. And if you zoom into Shear, what it looks like is about 2 compartments. In the middle of it is the endothelial compartment, which is a perfusible endothelial lined channel. And surrounding it is a biomaterial that encapsulates human hepatocytes, so these 3D microlivers that I mentioned before. And you can perturb it by adding either hemodynamics or bloodborne stimuli or both at the same time, and then observe what multicellular interactions happen between the endothelial cells and the microlivers. And just to zoom into what the device actually looks like, because I've only shown you cartoons so far, so the device actually looks very similar to what we set out to design it as. And if you zoom into the hepatocytes themselves, you can see that the hepatocytes exhibit hepatocyte-specific markers for long periods of time. And what we've also shown is that these devices have perfusible vascular barrier function. So again, there's this nice cylindrical channel that we have, and this cylindrical channel also has positive expression of what we call picoterin. Picoterin is a tight junction marker for endothelial cells, and it's a very important. It's an important part of the mechanosensory complex. So if we want to study hemodynamics and flow, we need positive expression of this tight junction marker throughout the entire device. We've also shown that the device maintains compartmentalization, i.e., the hepatocytes don't fuse with the endothelial cells, so they maintain separate for at least a week, which is the period that we're using. And next, what we wanted to see is whether these devices respond to flow. So we set up an experiment where we have 2 conditions. One is a static condition where you have just the media but no flow going through the channel. And when we do that, we see that you don't get any actin alignment at all. And also, we don't see any nitric oxide production. However, now, if you include flow in the system by utilizing the oscillatory rocker-based platform, we get actin alignment along the direction of the flow. And we also get increased nitric oxide production, which is what we would expect in a flow-based setting. So far what I've shown you is on the vascular side. What we also wanted to test was how the hepatocytes and the microlivers were doing in these devices. And as I mentioned before, the hepatocyte has about 500 different functions. So typically what we do is we categorize them into different bins, and then we have a proxy for each bin. So the first bin is protein synthesis, and the proxy we utilize is production of albumin. As you can see, the hepatocytes in these devices are producing increasing amounts of albumin to about 4 to 5 days, and then those levels are stabilizing. And this is also what we see in some of our other platforms. Next, we've shown for nitrogen metabolism, a good proxy is urea production, and we're showing measurable levels of urea in this device throughout its entirety. And lastly, what we also want to assay is the drug detoxification capabilities of our devices. One of the most important functions of the liver is its ability to detoxify xenobiotics. And the way we probe it is by putting a drug on the system and then seeing whether we get increased expression of drug metabolizing enzymes. And by doing that, we've shown that we get increased expression of what we call the cytochrome P450 molecules, the CYP3A4. And that is again very similar to what we've seen in other platforms. So far what I've shown you is that we can create an integrated vascular liver model, and we can have good homeostatic functions in this model. But next, what I want to see is whether we can get hepatocytes to enter cell cycle in this model. And to do that, we'll incorporate a lot of different elements that I mentioned before, such as hemodynamics and bloodborne stimuli. So before I get into the data, I just want to set up the experimental design. So to do this, we first create the microlivers by taking hepatocytes and coagulating them with these stromal cells. We put them in the shear devices, and then we stratify these devices across different conditions. So just to orient you to the symbols here, each circle is a different condition, and the black bar in the middle represents the endothelial light channel, and the gray circles around it are the microlivers. And the green arrows on top represent flow or no flow. So in the devices where you don't have flow, you don't see any green arrows. And then we take the perfuse data from these devices, and then we utilize a multiplex proteomics analysis through a luminance speed assay to assay for a large number of proteins. So what I'm going to show you is just a small subset of the proteins that we've assayed. So the first thing to note is that when we add all three different components, such as hepatocytes, endothelial cells, and flow into our device, we get increased production of this entire of a large subset of these proteins. However, if you take out either one of those components, if you take out flow, like I did in the third condition, or you take out hepatocytes, like I did in the fourth condition, you get low concentration of these factors in the perfuse, which suggests to us that the multicellular signaling and the hemodynamics, i.e. shown by flow, are very important in this platform. So just to highlight two of the factors that I mentioned before, we have hepatocyte growth factor and we have vascular endothelial growth factor, and both of these are upregulated when you add both endothelial cells, hepatocytes, and flow. So this is what that system looks like. Canonically, the endothelial cells are the ones that are producing HGF, and the hepatocytes are the ones that are producing VEGF. But the question is, are these hepatocytes entering cell cycle? And the answer was no. So just by adding flow, we could not get the hepatocytes to enter cell cycle. So next, we hypothesized that what if you also add in blood-borne stimuli in addition to the flow, maybe the hepatocytes can then enter cell cycle. And to do that, we added in this cytokine called IL-1 beta. And when we do that, we see massive upregulation of all of the factors that I showed before. Specifically, I want to point out HGF and VEGF. Those two are regulated again, like they were before. But another factor that I want to point out is called prostaglandin E2, which I'll refer to as PG2 for the rest of the talk. And PG2 does have a very rich history behind it. So I just want to point out some of the work that Dr. Dawson, who's also on the committee, has shown with PG2. He's shown in a beautiful Cell paper 2009 that if you take zebrafish livers and you perform partial hepatectomy on these livers and observe as the liver grows back, there's two factors that are important. One is this pathway called the Wnt pathway, and the other is synthesis of PG2. So if you either do not activate Wnt or you don't have PG2 synthesis, you're going to get impaired regeneration, as shown by this data in multiple different ways here. I.e., it suggests to us that PG2 could potentially be a pro-proliferative factor for hepatocytes. So just to recap what I've shown you so far, I've shown you that flow itself is very important for upregulating a lot of these blood-borne stimuli, for a lot of these soluble factors. I've shown that when you add in blood-borne stimuli, you get even higher upregulation of a lot of these factors. And I've also shown you that IL-1 beta leads to increased production of PG2. So then we hypothesized that why don't we just add IL-1 beta to our system and observe cell cycling and also add exogenous PG2 and see whether we can get the same effect. So again, we created our microlivers. This time we added in another component, which is called the Fuji sensor. And the way the Fuji sensor works is that it tags the hepatocyte nuclei, and depending on which phase of the cell cycle it's in, you're going to get a different color as a fluorescent reader. So if the hepatocytes are in the G1 phase of the cell cycle, the nuclei will look red. If they're in the S, G2, and M phase of the cell cycle, the nuclei will look green. And if they're in the transition, it'll look yellow or colorless, depending on where it's at. And then we put them in the shear devices, and then we again stratify it across different conditions, and then we quantify based on fluorescence microscopy. So when we do that, what we see is, again, as I mentioned before, if we just add flow to the devices without any blood-borne stimuli, you don't get any cell cycling in the hepatocyte. So that can be quantified by almost no RFP or GFP signal, almost no red or green signal. Then we added IL-1 beta as a blood-borne stimulus into our platform, and we got some upregulation. So what I'm showing you is just a subset of the data. We have, images across the entire device and multiple devices. I'll show quantification just in a second. And then we added exogenous PG2, and we showed that we got a very similar response as we did with the IL-1 beta. So if you quantify all this data, what you see is that you get more cyclic hepatocytes when you either add IL-1 beta or you add PG2. But the pro-proliferative effect is stronger when you have exogenous PG2. But then we hypothesize that maybe PG2 is in fact the mediator of the IL-1 beta induced response. And to test this, we set up a new experiment. So we took the endothelial cells that were lining the blood vessels. So again, what I've shown you so far is you take flow and you add an IL-1 beta, you get increased cell cycling, which is shown by green here. But then the question is, what is that mediator in the middle that's actually getting these hepatocytes to enter cell cycle? And to do that, we have to look at the biosynthetic pathway for PG2. So PG2 is biosynthesized through arachidonic acid, and there's a bunch of different enzymes that are important. But the last enzyme that's important in the final step is called PG synthase. So then we try to knock out PG synthase utilizing a CRISPR-Cas9-based system. And when we do that, you see almost no expression of PG2, of PG synthase anymore. We've also tested PG2 production from these cells, and we show that we in fact don't get any PG2 production. So then we put the old endothelial cells, the wild type ones that have PG2 production, and then we put the new ones as well that have this knocked out, and then we put them in our devices and see what happens. So as you can see on the top, I'm showing the control, which is again the wild type endothelial cells, and as you can see, they enter the cell cycle again just fine. However, now if you have the knocked out PG2 endothelial cells, the hepatocytes are not entering cell cycle anymore. And this can be quantified by this graph over here. In other words, our hypothesis that these multi-cell interactions are required to promote cell cycling was in fact correct. So just to summarize what I've shown you so far in the first two sections of this talk is that if we have a shear device that we've created, which is an integrated vascularized platform, and we add in exogenous parameters such as hemodynamics and bloodborne stimuli, we get increased production of PG2 by the endothelial cells, so it's all endothelium derived. And because of the PG2, the hepatocytes start to enter cell cycle, but if you knock out the PG2 production, the cell cycle response is also activated. But as I showed before, there's also other endothelial-derived stimuli, such as HGF and WNT2, and we hypothesize there's many others out there as well. And our goal is now to take the panoply of cytokines that I showed before that were upregulated in the IL-1 beta setting and scan through that system utilizing, supervised and unsupervised machine learning techniques to see if we can identify other factors. And in the end, our goal is to take all these factors, incorporate them in these graphs that we can then implant in vivo so that we can see expansion in vivo. So for the next phase of the talk, I'm going to focus on the immunogenicity of these hepatic constructs. So far I've talked about how we can create a model and how we can utilize that model to study how the hepatocytes enter cell cycle. So for the protect section, I want to just set the table first. So when you have immune mismatch between the donor and the recipient, so for example, if I'm giving you my cells, right, and we are immunologically mismatched, what's going to happen is your cells are going to get recognized as non-self, or my cells are going to get recognized as non-self by your T cells, and then the T cells are going to utilize the surface molecules to attack your cells. And once that happens, it's the process that we call graft rejection. And typically the way it's controlled clinically right now is through the utilization of systemic immunosuppressants. So these are drugs that are injected intravenously most of the time. But the problem is that systemic immunosuppression has a lot of side effects. So there are side effects such as nephrotoxicity, neurotoxicity, diabetes. It's also contraindicated in a lot of different conditions. So for example, if somebody has pre-existing cancer, they typically cannot get systemic immunosuppression. And just to also put this in context, if you get systemic immunosuppression, you're about 100 to 200 times more likely to get skin cancer at some point in your life. In fact, 30% of the patients who get put on systemic immunosuppression will get squamous cell carcinoma in the next 20 years. So that means that there's a clinical opportunity for the need to prevent these immunosuppressant drugs. So what a lot of people have discussed is instead of utilizing these systemic immunosuppressants, why don't we just create graft tolerance locally where we need it? So to do this, people have devised a bunch of different techniques. The first one is what we call hypoimmune cells. The way this works is you take the cell that you want to protect, you knock out these surface molecules that I mentioned before, such as HLA molecules, and then you upregulate other molecules such that these cells then don't get recognized by natural killer cells. And when you do that, when you infect these cells, they typically are very hypoimmune. But I've also created a rubric that we can then maybe look at all these different techniques and grade them by. So one thing that's important for clinical translation is universal compatibility. So any technique that we can create must be compatible with a bunch of different cell types. Any technique that we can create must also be tunable because you don't always want immunosuppression because that's the whole point. And lastly, it must also be persistent, such that if you want it for the lifelong period, you can have it so that it doesn't just turn off at some point. So when you grade hypoimmune cells by this rubric, what you see is that they're not typically universally compatible because the modification potential of a lot of these cells is variable. So it's very hard to modify certain cells, but it's very easy to modify other ones. So it doesn't really work for everything. It's not really tunable because you're essentially knocking out all these HLA molecules. So once they're gone, they're gone. They're not coming back. But it is persistent because it's the cell-based therapy and cells are constant factors of immunosuppression. So the next way people have done it is by tethering the immunosuppression not onto the cells itself, but onto the biomaterials that are surrounding the cells. So the way this works is, again, you take these immunosuppressant molecules and you put them in these grafts in the biomaterials itself. And when you do that, the problem is not all biomaterials are compatible with all cells. In order to make biomaterials for a bunch of different cell types, you need to do them in a personalized way. It is tunable because biomaterials engineering has come long enough where this can be done, but it is not persistent because even though we can tune the degradation kinetics of biomaterials, once you put them inside the body, they often degrade and remodel pretty quickly. The last one is this idea of mixed chimerism. I'm not going to go too much into detail about how this works, but the general idea is that now instead of the recipient just recognizing its own cells itself, it's also going to recognize the donor cells itself. So essentially it's been taught to recognize another person's cells as its own self, so it isn't attacked. And when you do that, you do get universal compatibility because now it can recognize another person's immune system. It's not tunable because once it's done, and it's really hard to turn around. But it is persistent because the immune system has been being taught and there's memory there. So our goal is to create a system that essentially checks all of these different boxes. And to do that, we came up with a new tool called Shield. And the way Shield works is that it uncouples the source of tolerance from the cell that we want to protect. So let's say you want to protect these parenchymal cells. Instead of modifying these cells, which are really hard to modify to begin with, why don't we modify the cell types that we want to put around these cells? As I showed you before, these cell types often don't function as well when they're by themselves. They often need these other cell types to work well. So why don't we just modify these other cell types? And that's our goal. So we're going to take these stromal cells and endothelial cells and upregulate these surface molecules that are called immune checkpoint proteins on them. And then we'll see whether we can get this protection utilizing this bystander effect that I mentioned. So the question then is, which immune checkpoint proteins do you want to upregulate? Because there's a whole panel. So to do this, we went back to the drawing board and we looked at the immune rejection cascade. And typically the way immune rejection happens is that once you put in the graft, you have the innate immune cells that come in and they create an initial injury. Then those antigens get picked up by antigen-presenting cells. Those antigen-presenting cells then go and prime T cells to go ahead and kill the graft. So there's 3 steps essentially to this process. So we wanted to inhibit all 3 steps of this process. So first, we're going to upregulate this molecule called PD-L1. PD-L1 inhibits the adaptive T cell response, so that's the final response that kills the graft. So we want to inhibit that. Second is we're going to upregulate this molecule called CD47. CD47 works in 2 different ways. They can inhibit the innate immune response by directly inhibiting macrophage signaling, but it can also inhibit antigen presentation by doing the same thing but on antigen-presenting cells, such as dendritic cells. And lastly, even if these 2 things don't work perfectly, we want some sort of a negative feedback loop. And to do that, we'll upregulate these molecules called CD39 and CD73, and they'll just take whatever killing that these guys can't inhibit and just downregulate even further. So it's essentially just a negative feedback. So I'm only going to show you data from PD-L1 because a lot of this work is still ongoing. But the idea for us eventually is to incorporate all 3 of these simultaneously into our graft. So just to recap how this is going to work, so you can visualize it, we're going to take the parenchymal cells and we're going to put support cells around it. But when these support cells are unmodified, so when they don't have those immune checkpoint proteins, what's going to happen is that immune cells are going to enter this graft. They're going to activate and they're going to kill the graft. However, now, if you modify these support cells, what we call now protectors, now immune cells will enter the graft and they'll undergo the state that we call exhaustion. And instead of killing the graft will stay persistent. So this is sort of the mechanistic underpinnings of how this is supposed to work. And now I'm going to dig into the data. So to create these protector cells, we utilize a lentiviral-based gene transfer. So there's a lot of different ways of modifying cells, but we pick lentiviruses because they integrate into the genome and then you can create stable lines by utilizing antibiotic selection markers. When you do that, as you can see, we get cell lines, the protector cell lines that are stable for many passages, and they show pretty clear upregulation of all these different factors that I talked about. So not only do we upregulate them on the stromal cells, but we also did the same thing for the endothelial cells. And just to show you some of the data for the endothelial cells, so again, these are HUVECs, which are endothelial cells, that in one case won't have any modifications, i.e. they're wild type, and in the other case, they'll have PD-L1 upregulated on them. So when you take the wild type cells and add in T cells to the system, what's going to happen is that entire blood vessel is going to collapse. You're not going to see any barrier function as you would expect because these are HLA mismatched. However, now if you upregulate PD-L1 on these endothelial cells and add in those T cells, you get no immune response whatsoever. These blood vessels are completely intact and there's been no cytotoxicity in the system. So just to recap what I've shown you so far is that we can show that by upregulating PD-L1 in a cell, you can protect the cell itself. But the whole concept was that you want to use a bystander effect to protect other cell types. And that's what I'll be probing in the second experiment. And to do this, just to recap again, the whole goal is that you're upregulating PD-L1 on the stromal cells, which is the protector layer, and that's going to exhaust these T cells so that they can go out and attack these cells. And to design this experiment, we'll take those microlivers, but we'll make a simple tweak. So instead of aggregating both the hepatocytes and the stromal cells at the same time, we're going to first aggregate the hepatocytes, so they form the core, and then we're going to put stromal cells around them, so the stromal cells can now form a barrier, which looks exactly like this. So again, the core that you see in the dark are these hepatocytes, and the light cells that are surrounding it are the stromal cells. And the goal is that when you have infiltrating T cells that come in, they're going to see the stromal barrier before they get into the core, so that they can get exhausted. And to assay this system, we're going to put T cells that have been engineered to recognize these hepatocytes so that they can kill them. So this is the data that I'm showing. So just to orient you first, on the y-axis, what I'm showing is albumin production. As you might recall, albumin production is a good proxy for hepatocyte viability. And the different bars represent the different conditions. So the white bar represents the control condition where you have normal hepatocytes, normal stromal cells, and no T cells on top. The gray bar represents the normal hepatocytes with normal stromal cells, but with T cells on top. So you see you get really low albumin synthesis compared to the control condition. However, now, if you add in stromal cells that have PD-L1 upregulated on their cells, on their surface, and nothing on the hepatocytes itself, you still see the similar levels of protection. In fact, these are producing albumin at almost the same levels as the control cells that even have no proteins. So this was a pretty incredible result because this is the first time we've seen that not only can you protect the cell type itself, but you can also utilize a bystander effect to protect other cell types in this vicinity. And for clinical translation, we are really interested in making the system tunable because the idea is that if you have persistent expression of PD-L1 on the surface, you can imagine this turning carcinogenic at some point. So we really don't want that. So we want to have a system where the clinician can go in and turn the system off when they want to. So to do that, we utilize a tetracycline-based system. So at first, what I'm going to show you is these protector cells that have PD-L1 expression on them. So this is a control, very little PD-L1 expression. You add in the PD-L1 using a lentiviral-based system, you get increased PD-L1 expression. But now you add a repressor on top of it. So again, the expression is completely annulled. Then you add a tetracycline, which is just essentially an exogenous small molecule at different concentrations, and then you can see you can recover this PD-L1 levels, but it's also reversible because once you wash it off, all this comes back. In other words, we can cycle PD-L1 on and off depending on whatever frequency that we want. So it is a tunable system, and it's a tunable platform. And not only is this important for clinical translation, it can also allow us to study very interesting scientific hypotheses, such that we can test now in the system as to how long do we even need this PD-L1 expression for. Maybe you just need it at the beginning, and then you can turn it out, and the hepatocytes will have some sort of immunity. We can test all these questions on this side. So just to summarize again, if you compare our new system across the different tools that exist out there, we think we can check a lot of these different boxes, because not only can you protect hepatocytes in this way, you can also protect other cell types, like as islet cells. We're currently in the process of testing that. You can also make it tunable, as I've shown. And since these are cell-based therapies, right, the stromal cells, as long as they integrate when you put them inside of the body, they should always be a source of localized immunosuppression. This can be a persistent system. So just to summarize the end of my talk, what I want to tell you is we've developed a platform that has an integrated vascularized liver system, and what this platform allows us to do is it allows us to turn a bunch of different knobs that we can then use to test a bunch of different hypotheses. And we've turned a lot of these knobs to see whether we can get hepatocytes to enter cell cycle by adding in exogenous factors like flow and factors like blood-brain stimuli. And we've shown that not only can we get the hepatocytes to enter cell cycle, but we also know what the mediator of this response is, which is PG2. And lastly, what I've also shown in the third section of my talk, second wave, and typically we've seen this across a lot of different technologies, the second wave tends to be a lot higher. And myself and a lot of others think that currently we're the second wave of cell-based therapy, so it's actually a pretty exciting time to be in this field. And with that, I'll conclude the scientific portion of my talk and go into the fun portion of it, which is where I get to thank you guys for helping me over the last 6 years. So first I want to start off with thanking Sangeeta. Sangeeta's been an excellent advisor over the last 6 years, and she took me into a lab even when I had zero biological background. I had not seen cells under a microscope when I started in this lab, which was very challenging for me to get started, but it's been a very fruitful process, and I've learned so much over the last 6 years. I actually have 2 stories I will tell. So when I was an undergrad, a freshman in undergrad, they have these programs called the NSF REU. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a research experience for undergraduates. The idea is that you apply, and then you go work for the summer at some other institution. So after my freshman year, I was looking at some of these programs, and as I was scrolling through a lot of the different labs, I came across Sangeeta's lab. And when I came across it, I was like, this is really cool. It would be cool to work in this lab someday. And to this day, I still have that bookmark in my phone tabs. And when I first came in, I was like, okay, I have to look this lab and I have to reach out to her. So I'm glad you and Heather do a lot of outreach, because that's how I actually first learned about this lab. Second story is that I was at a consulting seminar 3 weeks ago. Not sure why, because I hate consulting, but sorry. But the idea was that they were telling us how important mentorship is throughout your academic and non-academic process. And they were trying to contrast the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. And just the summary is that mentors typically give you advice when you reach out to them, and sponsors are very proactive in providing you advice. So they're the ones who go out of their own way to help you out. And I think Sangeeta has actually transitioned from just being a mentor to actually being a sponsor in my career. And I look forward to working with you in the future. I also want to thank my collaborators. Chris has essentially become a second advisor to me, and I always appreciate your scientific, very deep, insightful questions anytime I show some data. It always trips me up, but I've always learned a lot from it. I also want to thank Greco. Greco has been a huge part of all these experiments that I've shown. In fact, all of the devices that are created for these experiments were all created actually by Greco. And every time we wanted to do an experiment, I would email him or text him, be like, hey, Greco, we're going to do this experiment. He would almost always say yes, even though it often involved collecting media over the weekends. So thank you for that, Greco. I also want to thank my committee chair, Wolfram. I don't know if you remember Wolfram, we actually met in 2014 at the FAST Liver Conference. It was the last night. It's a lot of libations, so I don't remember exactly. But you and I were talking, and what I remember from that conversation is that, wait, this guy's an eminent professor, and he's actually really fun to talk to. So when Sangeeta recommended that I add him to my committee, I was very excited. So thank you for that, Sangeeta. Thank you for being an excellent source of help. I also want to thank everybody else in the lab, specifically a huge shout out to Heather, Sue, Rini, and Tarek. All these people make everything that we do in the lab possible. A good analogy is that if Sangeeta is the mitochondria of the lab, these people are the endoplasmic reticulum. Some of you will get this. Specifically, I want to give a huge shout out to Heather. Heather's been a huge source of personal and intellectual support throughout my entire career. Every time I needed help, she was there for me, whether it was on a personal basis or on a scientific basis. Pretty much anything you see that comes out of the lab, whether it's a talk or a paper or a grant, all has Heather's fingerprints all over it. And she's such a huge source of support for not just myself, but for everybody. Also want to thank the people that I work most closely with in the lab, which is the liver bank. Amanda, Cable, Tiffany, Poynton, and also Trevor, who's not here. He's in New York right now. We've had a lot of fun times together. We were at Tiffany's wedding. We've been to a bunch of different conferences. We've also had a bunch of different fun dinners. This is actually for a birthday party. Amanda, myself, and Trevor actually have clustered birthdays, so we often celebrate together. And specifically, I want to give a shout out to Amanda. Amanda has been my closest friend and confidant in lab. She's been there for me every step of the way, and I'm really excited that I got a chance to work with her. Thanks. Also, I want to thank Ravi. Ravi was my undergrad roommate, so we actually met serendipitously. We just got put in the same suite together, but then as it turns out, we were in the same major, and then we ended up working in the same lab for 4 years. And then finally, when undergrad was done, I was like, okay, I need to get away from you. So I went and got a PhD, and he went to the corporate lab, but then he ended up getting an MBA at MIT anyway, so we ended up meeting together. No, it's actually been a lot of fun. We've traveled a lot of different places now at this point. We went to India together. We took some amazing photos by the Taj Mahal, which is awesome. So thank you, Ravi. Next person I want to thank is Karn. Karn and I grew up together when we were in India, but we never spoke there. We actually started speaking when the two of us moved to the United States within about a year of each other. And since then, we've become very close friends. So I was at his brother's wedding, and we've traveled again a lot of different places together. I want to thank the entire interesting community. Some of you are here today. You guys have been awesome, both personally and intellectually. Specific shout out to Guresh, who's been my roommate for the last 5.5 years now, I think. And Guresh has been a huge part of my day-to-day life. Every day I would come home, and we'd have very interesting conversations, both about our personal lives and about the work that we're doing. When I was looking for photos for Guresh, I could not find a single photo of the two of us, just the two of us together. So we definitely need to fix that. But then I spoke to Melissa about this, and she sends me this really creepy photo that she took. And she took this photo because the two of us were wearing the same shirt on. So thanks for that. Also want to thank my two friends, Manan and Akansha. Both of them are in India. They couldn't make it obviously today, but we grew up together. Every time I go back to India, I always get to see them. I was at their wedding. Anytime I need anything, they're always there for me. Also want to thank my entire family, my mom, my dad, my brother, my grandparents, and also my maternal grandparents who couldn't make it today. Now we actually have 2 families that are merging together, so Melissa and I are getting married next year, so we'll also have her family being part of ours. And my parents, I just want to mention that they made some huge sacrifices for me to be here today. They both were established doctors in India, and they gave up their lives, and they moved here so that we can have better lives, and thank you for that. Also some other fun photos with Melissa now in the picture. And also want to give a huge shout out to my cousins who made it all the way from California, and also my uncle and aunt who came all the way from India. Last but not the least, I want to thank my fiance Melissa. She's been there for me every step of the way over the last 2 years. She's been the most important person in my life. And she's the kindest human being I've ever met. And every day I strive more and more to be like her. So thank you for being here with us. I'm looking forward to getting married this year. Also, just a huge shout out to Melissa's mom and her sister as well, who also made it out in California, and I would respect. So with that, I will end both the intellectual and acknowledgement section of my talk, and I'll open up the floor to questions. by this.
Any questions, Arnav?
Did you do any characterization of those T cells when you're looking at their?
Yeah, that's a great question because as I mentioned, when you put the T cells inside these platforms, the T cells are also changing, right? So currently we're in the process of looking at doing flow cytometry on these T cells to see whether they're exhibiting markers of exhaustion. So specific markers we're looking at like TIM3, LAG3, PD1, and all these markers express exhaustion. So we're currently in the process of doing that. But that's a great question.
Oh, you can't have him get off too easy.
He's pre-coached everybody.
Actually, I'm gonna ask a question, but I have no background in any of this. You said the thing in the middle and thing that surrounds the middle. You did something with the outside instead of the inside. Why didn't you handle the actual core?
Yeah, so the idea is that the core has the cell type that we want to protect. So we're only modifying, but that cell type is really hard to modify. So if we want to manipulate the cell type inside, we're going to get low efficiencies there. So what ends up happening is even if you modify them, you're going to get 10-20% efficiency, so you're going to lose a lot of the cells. So that's why we only modify the periphery that's surrounding the core. And by doing that, we can still get similar levels of protection.
Okay, so the thing that's around it, you're kind of programming it so that
It protects what's inside, yeah. So it's basically a barrier. Good question.
Hey.
Hi.
I don't know, how are you? Just curious, how large were these little islets that you had?
Yeah, so they're anywhere from 100 to 200 microns. It's pretty teeny. So depending on the size of sort of the micro walls that we utilize, and depending on how many cells we put in there, and depending on how many, the ratio between the cells to the fibroblasts, we can tune that size. So I think we can go anywhere realistically from about 50 to 300 microns. At least with the current technologies, we can modulate that even more.
And say, down the road, when
Yeah.
you're actually going to be done all of your
Yeah.
testing, et cetera, how do you plan on actually like implanting these and keeping your structure?
Yeah.
Like what would that look like?
That's a very good question. So it depends on the biomaterial that we're using. So if you use, for example, a biomaterial that doesn't degrade as quickly, it tends to be pretty stiff to begin with. So then you can suture these inside of many different regions. So what we often do for in vivo studies is we suture it to the fat pad. So it's in the mesenteric regions, the mesenteric fat pad. And what happens is that actually, since you have endothelial cells in there, there's some cues, it recruits blood vessels from the outside. And then it integrates into the vasculature so that it can sustain for long periods of time. So it just depends on which knobs that we want to turn. I think between different biomaterials, we can definitely find something that is suitable for humans as well. Jesse.
Great talk, Arnav. I feel like I often kind of bring this question up when the liver people talk about their work, but so the work that's been done a lot so far in the work that you've been presenting is focused on this ectopic graft that can integrate vasculature, but is not in series with the native hepatic vasculature, which of course limits the applications of that graft to diseases in which you're trying to replace some function, but not trying to replace all functions.
Exactly.
So how could you imagine modifying the current design in order to be able to kind of connect with the native hepatic plumbing to kind of work with operating?
Yeah, so what we can foresee is, so one of the problems why it's really hard to integrate directly into the native liver parenchyma is these high portal pressures that exist there. So people have tried intraoral injections, and because these chronic liver patients have these high pressures, a lot of them actually end up not engrafted. So we have this low engraftment problem. So there's this clinical procedure called Thesis. You guys obviously know about this, but it's called transjugular intrahepatic portosystemic shunt. Essentially, you're shunting the, if I can remember this correctly, you're shunting the portal vein to the hepatic vein, and what that ends up doing is now you're just skipping all that, fibrotic parenchyma. So if you could utilize that in the beginning to reduce some of these portal pressures, maybe then you can implant things that are more in series as opposed to more anti. Or you could use some anti-fibrotic medications that are currently trying to get on the market, like MMP inhibitors, etc.
So given the role of the cell-cell interaction with the endothelial cells, do you think you can incorporate the systems with like organoids or other systems to increase the proliferation? And do you think the proliferation that you are inducing are causing the hepatocytes to change their fate, so they're becoming more despecialized in a sense since they're undergoing cycling? Or what do you think is actually happening to the hepatocytes?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I'll tackle the organoid question first. So yeah, I mean, quantum cleavers, as you know, has shown that you can take hepatocytes from many different sources and add in all these different stimuli, like Wnt signals, cyclic AMP signals, right? And as long as you can maintain what he calls like the LGR5 positive expression, and you have exogenous correspondence, so you get that Wnt signaling cascade, you can get proliferation of these organoids and you can passage them across many different passages. So it is possible, obviously. The second part of the question, which if you might, yeah, so are the hepatocytes changing, right? Because they're proliferating. So at least in our hands, I haven't done very thorough characterization of the phenotype of the hepatocyte, but we've shown that the albumin levels that they produce actually goes down when these hepatocytes are entering cells. And I was at I don't know if you remember this, Anita, but when we were at the liver meeting last year, actually, no, it was at a seminar here at the Broad. I think Marcus Crombie was actually talking about when hepatocytes enter cell cycle, they're often unregulating a lot of these synthetic hormones. So the idea is that they're basically directing all their resources to now go into proliferation and turning down things that they don't necessarily want. So there's definitely going to be a lot of phenotype changes that happen. But you know, as in the organoid system, the goal is to just induce that proliferation and turn it off. So take away what's in at some point.
We're going to conclude with this portion, and then I think we have to hold you all and suspend the animation. We're going to have a really grueling
Sounds good.
exam.
I got this.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.